Is there a dark side to the Stoic beliefs on love and sexuality? What forbidden lessons can the Stoics teach us about love and desire? Welcome to a journey into the depths of ancient wisdom, a voyage back to the early 3rd century BCE to uncover the Stoic secrets of Zeno of Citium. Stoicism, a philosophy that has withstood the test of time, offers us not just teachings on resilience and peace, but also provides a profound perspective on love and sexuality, aspects of life intensely personal and universally challenging. Today, we dive into the Stoic belief that true happiness comes from living rationally and virtuously, not merely in accordance with our fleeting desires, but aligned with the very essence of nature and reason. But what does this mean for our understanding of love and sexuality? How do we reconcile these ancient teachings with the passionate throes of contemporary romantic love? We will explore 10 aspects of sexuality and love according to Stoicism, perspectives that may appear dark or challenging, yet are incredibly enlightening. These views invite us to question our assumptions and prompt us to think deeply about what it means to love, not just wisely and well, but in harmony with the greater fabric of the universe. 1. Indifference to sensual pleasure. Stoicism teaches that sexual pleasure is neither inherently good nor bad. What matters is how we engage with our desires and pleasures. Imagine for a moment someone named Alex. Alex lived much of their early adult life swayed by the highs of passionate encounters, mistaking intensity for intimacy and confusion for love. Each relationship, driven by passion, burned brightly but faded quickly, leaving Alex feeling increasingly empty and disconnected. This cycle continued until Alex discovered Stoicism. Stoicism taught Alex that love and sex, like all aspects of life, should be approached rationally and without being controlled by desire. This doesn't mean rejecting these experiences, but engaging with them in a way that is thoughtful and considerate, emphasizing duty and respect over mere passion. For Alex, this was transformative. It meant learning to value deep, meaningful connections over fleeting excitement. It meant prioritizing shared values and mutual respect, rather than being driven by the chaos of unbridled emotions. The Stoic approach to love and sex is not about suppression. Rather, it's about integration. It's about recognizing our desires without letting them dominate us. It invites us to enjoy life's pleasures, but also to remain free from their grip. Consider how this philosophy can impact your own life. How often have you felt at the mercy of your desires, or mistaken passion for a genuine connection? How might your relationships change if you approach them with a balance of reason and emotion, duty and pleasure? 2. Apatheia, also known as emotional detachment. To the Stoics, true freedom was freedom from passion, which they viewed as a form of temporary madness, an irrational attachment that could cloud judgment and lead to turmoil. Let's consider the story of David, a man who once lived at the mercy of his emotions, especially in his romantic relationships. David's passionate love affairs were intense but volatile, filled with exhilarating highs, followed by devastating lows. This cycle of emotional turmoil led him to seek a different path, one that eventually brought him to the teachings of Stoicism. David learned that emotional detachment wasn't about being cold or unfeeling. Rather, it was about cultivating a state of inner calmness and clarity, freeing himself from the chaotic sway of fleeting feelings. By embracing apatheia, David discovered a more stable and serene way to experience life and relationships. He found that when he stopped allowing his passions to control him, he could engage in his relationships more fully and authentically. He was no longer chasing the illusion of dramatic passion, but was instead building connections based on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. Imagine the peace that comes from not being tossed about by every wave of feeling that comes your way. Think about the relationships you could nurture when not driven by the need for constant emotional validation. David's story is a testament to the strength and stability that Stoic emotional detachment offers. As we reflect on this, I encourage you to consider the possibilities that such a perspective might open up in your own life. How could emotional detachment enhance not only your romantic relationships, but also your overall emotional well-being? How might a calmer, more stable approach to feelings transforms your interactions and your life's trajectory? 3. Utility over romance. Stoicism teaches us to view relationships not merely as vessels for emotional fulfillment, but as partnerships based on mutual support and practical benefits, such as procreation and stability. Let's consider the story of Michael, a man who embraced this Stoic principle in his approach to marriage. Like many, Michael initially believed that romantic love was the foundation of a successful marriage. However, after experiencing the dissolution of a marriage that was based solely on the intense feelings of romantic love, which faded over time, Michael reevaluated his perspective on relationships. When he encountered Stoicism, Michael was struck by the idea of marrying wisely, choosing a partner based on compatibility, shared values, and common life goals, rather than merely on the flames of passion. When Michael met Anna, he approached the relationship with this new mindset. They discussed their expectations for life, their beliefs about parenting, and their career goals to ensure they were aligned. Their marriage, founded on mutual respect, shared purpose, and practical considerations, proved to be profoundly stable and satisfying. Michael and Anna were able to support each other through challenges, collaborate on common goals, and build a family on a foundation of shared responsibility and understanding, rather than volatile passion alone. This story invites us to reconsider what makes relationships last. It challenges the modern narrative that romance is the sole or even the best foundation for marriage. Michael's experience shows us that when we look beyond romantic love to the practical and supportive elements of partnership, we might find a more durable and fulfilling form of relationship. Let Michael's story inspire you to think about your own relationships. Could a Stoic approach help you build stronger, more sustainable connections? How might considering utility as well as affection in choosing a partner support your long-term happiness and well-being? 4. Subordination of personal desire. This principle, deeply embedded in Stoic thought, teaches us that personal satisfaction, including sexual desire, is often secondary to our moral duties and responsibilities, especially within the context of marriage and community life. Let me introduce you to the story of Thomas, a man who found himself at a crossroads in life, grappling with the tension between personal desires and his commitments to his family and community. Thomas, like many, initially pursued personal gratification above all else, often at the expense of his deeper commitments. However, as he delved into the teachings of Stoicism, he encountered a different path, one that emphasized the greater good over individual whims. Thomas learned that by subordinating his immediate desires to his moral duties, he was not just denying himself pleasure, but was, in fact, building a foundation for a more fulfilling and meaningful life. He discovered that in placing the well-being of his family and the harmony of his community above his personal urges, he gained a sense of peace and satisfaction that fleeting pleasures had never provided. This shift was not easy. It required discipline, reflection, and a profound revaluation of what it means to live a good life. Yet, Thomas found that this Stoic practice brought him closer to his wife and children, deepening their relationships in ways that surprised him. His home became a place of mutual respect and understanding, rather than a battleground for conflicting desires. Now, imagine the impact of such a philosophy in our own lives. How often do we prioritize our immediate wants, only to find ourselves isolated or at odds with those we love? How might our relationships change if we viewed our duties to others as opportunities to cultivate virtue and inner strength? 5. Chastity and self-control. These concepts are not merely about abstaining from pleasures, but about mastering one's desires to lead a life of integrity and purpose. To the Stoics, such self-control was crucial, as excessive indulgence in any aspect of life including sexuality, was viewed as a failure of self-discipline and thus morally undesirable. Let us consider the story of Ethan, a man whose early adult life was marked by what many might see as enviable, a free-spirited approach to sexual experiences. However, Ethan felt increasingly unfulfilled. He found that his lack of self-control led not to freedom, but to a disquieting sense of drifting without purpose or fulfillment. The turning point came when Ethan encountered the teachings of Stoicism during a period of personal crisis. Ethan was struck by the Stoic ideal that virtues such as chastity and self-control was not about suppression, but about achieving true freedom from internal compulsions. He learned that by exercising self-control, he was not denying himself joy, but was instead opening the door to a more profound and sustainable form of happiness. This was not a journey of denial, but one of empowerment, of aligning his actions with his deeper values and ideals. As Ethan applied these principles, he experienced a transformation. His relationships became more meaningful, and his daily life became more centered and less chaotic. He found strength in the ability to say no to fleeting temptations and yes to a more substantial, virtue-driven life. Through his example, we can see that the pursuit of chastity and self-control is not about diminishing life's pleasures, but about enhancing personal integrity and emotional health. Imagine the impact of such self-mastery in your own life. Consider how the virtue of self-control could lead not just to personal growth, but to deeper and more fulfilling connections with others. How might your life change if you viewed self-discipline not as a limitation, but as a liberator? 6. Equality of the sexes in reason. Stoicism, a philosophy that dates back to ancient Greece, teaches that both men and women are equally capable of rational thought and virtue. This was a progressive idea, transcending the typical gender roles of the time. Consider the story of Brian, a modern man who discovered the enriching principles of Stoicism during a period of personal and professional uncertainty. As Brian delved into Stoic teachings, he was struck by the concept that rationality and virtue were not confined to one gender. This realization challenged him to reevaluate his own beliefs about gender roles in both his professional environment and his personal relationships. Inspired by Stoic philosophy, Brian began to advocate for equality in his workplace, promoting women into leadership roles that were traditionally held by men. He recognized the untapped potential of his colleagues, regardless of gender, and worked to foster an environment where rational thought and virtue dictated one's value, not their gender. In his personal life, Brian's newfound understanding transformed his approach to relationships. He began to value his partner not just for traditional roles, but as a true equal, capable of contributing just as significantly to decisions and life planning. This shift not only strengthened his relationships, but also brought a deeper sense of partnership and mutual respect. Brian's journey is a testament to the timeless relevance of Stoic philosophy. It shows us that when we embrace the idea that all human beings, regardless of gender, are capable of rationality and virtue, we open doors to a more just and equitable society. As we reflect on this, I encourage each of you to consider how these ancient principles can be applied in our modern world. How might your personal and professional lives change if you fully embrace the Stoic view of gender equality in reason? How much more harmonious could our societies be if we all recognized and actualized this principle? 7. Condemnation of adultery. In Stoicism, the criticism of such actions extends beyond the pain of emotional betrayal. It underscores a profound disrespect for self-control and the obligations we hold towards our families and society. Consider the story of James, a man who once found himself veering dangerously close to the seductive path of infidelity. James had always seen himself as a devoted husband and father. However, under the pressures of work and personal dissatisfaction, he began seeking solace outside his marriage. It was not just about seeking emotional or physical connection. It was a misguided attempt to escape from his responsibilities and challenges. James's potential lapse was not just a personal error, but a failing in his duties to his family and the ethical standards he had always valued. When he discovered Stoic philosophy, James was struck by its emphasis on self-control and the fulfillment of social and familial duties. Stoicism taught him that true contentment and honor come from mastering one's desires and living up to one's commitments. This realization led James to a profound personal transformation. He began to invest more deeply in his relationships at home, finding that the truest form of happiness and fulfillment lay in the integrity and the love that he cultivated with his family. He learned that self-control was not a restriction, but a pathway to a more profound and stable joy. Imagine the impact of embracing such a principle in our lives. How many families could be healed? How much personal regret could be avoided? 8. Acceptance of fate. The Stoics taught that wisdom lies in accepting what we cannot change, embracing life as it unfolds, and recognizing that even our difficulties serve a purpose on our path. Let's discuss the story of Richard, a man whose life journey beautifully illustrates this Stoic principle. Richard was in a long-term relationship that over the years became increasingly unfulfilling. He and his partner had drifted apart, yet they remained together, bound by routine and obligation. Initially, Richard struggled with frustration and dissatisfaction, feeling trapped in a situation that seemed to bring him more sadness than joy. However, Richard's encounter with Stoicism transformed his perspective. He learned about the concept of accepting one's fate, which does not mean passive resignation, but a deep acknowledgement of the reality of his circumstances. This acceptance empowered Richard to find peace with his situation. He began to see his relationship not as a trap, but as a part of his life's journey that was meant to teach him something valuable. Instead of harboring resentment or dreaming of what could be, Richard focused on cultivating his inner life and finding fulfillment in other areas. He engaged more deeply with his hobbies, expanded his social circle, and volunteered, enriching his life in ways he had previously neglected. This change didn't alter the reality of his relationship immediately, but it transformed Richard's experience of it. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances, but a student of his own life. This shift in mindset, this acceptance of fate, is a powerful tool. It can help us to endure with dignity and grace the parts of our lives that we cannot change. It teaches us resilience, and it brings us a profound inner peace. 9. Focus on internal virtue over external pleasure. The Stoics teach us that true contentment stems from internal virtue rather than external pleasures or circumstances. This is a lesson that challenges many of our modern assumptions about what it takes to be truly happy and fulfilled in life. Let me share with you the story of Charles, a man whose journey illustrates the power of this Stoic principle. Charles, like many, once believed that happiness was something that had to be found or earned through external means, whether through success, possessions, or even in the dynamics of his relationships. He believed that the perfect partner or a vibrant sex life was the key to his contentment. But despite his pursuits, Charles found that each new relationship, while exciting at first, eventually led to the same sense of emptiness. It wasn't until he encountered Stoicism that he began to see things differently. Stoicism taught him that external conditions, including the ups and downs of relationships and sexual experiences, are often beyond our control and not reliable sources of true happiness. Charles learned to shift his focus from seeking external validation to developing his internal virtues, wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. He realized that by cultivating these qualities, he could find a sense of peace and fulfillment that was independent of his relationship status or sexual encounters. Imagine the freedom that comes from this shift in perspective. Consider how liberating it is to realize that your happiness does not depend on someone else's presence or affection, but on your own internal state and virtues. Charles discovered that focusing on his personal growth and ethical living provided a more consistent and satisfying joy than any external pleasure could. As we reflect on this lesson, I encourage each of you to contemplate where your own sources of happiness come from. Are they external and fleeting, or are they internal, rooted in your character and virtues. As we conclude this exploration of the 9 dark secrets of sexuality and love in Stoicism, we are left with a treasure trove of insights that challenge our conventional views and urge us towards a deeper understanding of ourselves and our relationships. It is easy to be swayed by the immediate gratification of sensual pleasures or the intoxicating rush of romance. However, the Stoic teachings invite us to look beyond these transient delights to the stable ground of virtue. They ask us to consider love and sexuality not just as sources of pleasure or emotional fulfillment, but as opportunities to practice self-control, respect, and a deep commitment to the well-being of others. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of Stoicism. May the insights we've shared tonight inspire you to embrace a life of reason, virtue, and true love, enriching not only your own life, but also the lives of those around you. Let us move forward with the courage to transform our darkest secrets into our brightest truths. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up by hitting the like button below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content like this, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Thanks for being a part of our Modern Stoic Minds community.